Okay, for those who don't know me, my name is Chris Meyerson and I'm the current director of the Australian Urban Design Research Centre, a role that I obviously share with that previously held by tonight's presenter. I would like to introduce Dr. Kate Hislop, sitting against the wall over there, who's Dean, Head of the School of Design for the University of Western Australia, and we're both very happy to be co-hosting tonight's presentation. In addition to our roles in education, research, and publishing, one of the very important roles of AUDRC and the School of Design and the university generally is to generate thinking and, in our part, debate and propositions about urbanity and about the way in which we occupy the planet and that we live in centres. So on behalf of AUDRC and with Kate, on behalf of the UWA School of Design, we're very pleased to jointly welcome you to tonight's event and the presentation of what promises to be I think, profound proposition for how we can broaden our horizons as urban designers, architects and engineers, landscape architects, planners, geographers and others that really have a role in shaping cities, decision makers generally. I look forward to lots of following on questions and debate on that broader topic and on the presentation. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia, and that this meeting that we're having tonight is on the traditional lands of the Whadjuk people. I pay respect to elders past and present and to emerging elders, and recognising continuing connection to land, water and community. I would like us to learn more from the traditional owners about how to work with the land when we inhabit it and when we form cities that sit on that land. I'm also hoping that for those who haven't already done so, and Richard probably has got used to shamelessly asking for things from people, being in America for the last year or two, that those who haven't already done so will be inspired to ask why you haven't already enrolled in a Master in Urban Design course at AUDRC. Before going any further, I would like to welcome Dr. Julian Boliter to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Richard Buller. Thank you.
My task is somewhat redundant, given Richard's someone who generally doesn't need too much introduction, but for those who don't know him, Richard, when I first encountered him, taught at the Landscape Architecture program, School of Design, for many years. In 2012, he became the director of AUDRC, and in 2013, Richard moved to the States and assumed the role of the Meyerson Chair of Urbanism, Professor and Chair of Landscape Architecture, and the co-director of the Ian McHarg Center for Urbanism Ecology at the University of Pennsylvania. For those who don't know Richard, this move from the obscurity of Perth to one of the intellectual twin peaks of landscape architecture in the States, the University of Pennsylvania, would have been regarded as very unlikely in the extreme. For those who knew Richard, it was the fulfillment of a manifest destiny. He'd taken his rightful place on the world stage. There he is, sort of emerging on the stage. Richard has been using this platform to research global flashpoints between biodiversity and urban growth. The research is documented in his latest publication, a web-based platform, Atlas for the End of the World. And in collaboration with his partner, Dr. Tatum Hands, Richard is also creatively directs the LA Plus, an interdisciplinary journal for landscape architecture and urban design, I would say, which is beautiful and provocative. Richard and Tatum, it's great to have you back, for you to tell us about your Atlas for the End of the World in Perth. The end of the earth, in another word. Welcome home.
So, it's really nice to be here. Thank you for coming out. I wouldn't come out for a lecture by me. And I do feel like telling jokes because it's great to be surrounded by people who have a sense of humour again. But I'm actually going to try and do a really serious lecture. That's what I want to try and do. Whether I can do it or not, I don't know. I've never done this lecture. This is not something I'm shopping around. And the material is difficult, and I've been sitting in airports putting more stuff in, and it's grown into something of a monster. So I just want to get oriented here. What I'm going to do for you, the lecture is really titled designing a planet, can we? And what I'm going to do first, with the first few slides, before we actually get to the lecture proper, is give you a very, just a very cursory view into the literature that surrounds the topic of, or the question of whether design intelligence can engage with something like a planet, or whether design intelligence can function, can conceptualize, and whether it can get any real traction at a planetary scale. And it kind of pains me to say that, because you know, when somebody stands up and starts talking about the planet, it sounds like hubris. But I want to try and convince you that it's not. From what I think is happening, and I think it's incumbent upon all of us as designers, not just to scale up because it's an act of megalomania, but the Anthropocene demands of us as citizens that we try to comprehend the scale of our impact at the species level, and then ask the question, as designers, can we? How do you then act in a way that might be impactful or meaningful? And it doesn't necessarily mean acting at a very large scale. One can be very precise and have great impact through precision. So it's not just about scale. The opening slide is the cover of a publication that was produced in 2004. The title of the publication is Global Change and the Earth System, and I'll be referring to the Earth System throughout the lecture. And this publication was the result of, it only has 10 or 12 authors on the actual cover, the editors of the volume, but it was produced by literally thousands of scientists. And they'd been working together for, the organisation had worked together for almost 30 years. And what they were doing was trying to coordinate all of the reductive bits of intelligence and modelling about how the Earth works. So trying to combine the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere and the lithosphere. And not just to describe the biophysical, natural characteristics of something as complex as a planet, but most importantly, to try and understand our impact in that system. And in order to do that, you need, insofar as humanly possible, to have very sophisticated models. So we still don't actually have a model of the Earth system. We have approximations. And that's one of the beauties of the natural world, I suppose, is that you can never actually model it precisely. We've learnt that throughout the 20th century. We can't model what's happening inside an atom, and we certainly can't model what's happening at a planetary scale. Now, that said, the models that we do have are incredibly sophisticated and can reach from the molecular to the planetary and speak to us, provide us with feedback about our impact. So I think that could well be the most important book of the 21st century. I'm just going to say it, right? And it won't keep you up at night reading it like a novel, but it is fascinating, and it does conclude with scenarios. And of course, the conclusion of the book is that really it's an endorsement of the precautionary principle. That is, don't fuck with things you don't fully understand. And so, science's job is not to project futures. Science's job is to describe existing circumstances. It's up to designers to then project alternative futures and so on. And so what I'm going to do now is cross over to the humanities, where you see a different kind of literature. Now, and many of you will be aware of this, but in the humanities there has been a flurry of activity, and it's a lot of a kind of anxiety, I would say, across the humanities. And you can this is by no means a full or representative sample. These are just some texts that spring to mind, let's say. And you can notice there's a throughout this literature. I'm going to try and organise it for you in a moment and set up some, to try and make some sense of this activity. But economics, philosophy, theology, and above all, the nature of nature are being questioned like never before. Well, I shouldn't say never before, but certainly the dawn of the Anthropocene means that there is a certain intensity to the introspection of what we think we are and how we should dwell and how we should exist in relationship to the world around us. So it's a very interesting time to be alive, right? That's the beauty of it. Terrifying and sublime as it is, we're no longer scared of nature per se because we've altered it. We're scared of ourselves. But I mean, it would have been, for example, if you'd been born in the 10th century, or I mean, there wasn't a lot happening. You know, history was just not that interesting. We live in very, very interesting times, and the stakes are so high that I think it's fascinating. Now, if I try to organise the literature a little bit for you, and these categories that I'm setting up, this bracketing doesn't necessarily hold true, but I think on one end of the spectrum you have a group of thinkers, writers, an emerging politic, which I would refer to as eco-socialism. So it's trying to rework classic Marxist socialism with regard to the Anthropocene and the ecological crisis and climate change. And Naomi Klein is right, climate change does change everything. I mean, if you're not thinking about climate change, then you're kind of not even in the game. You're not part of contemporary culture. You just can't ignore it now. And it's a very hard thing to think through. So at the other end of the spectrum, across the top right of the slide, I've put the eco-modernists. The eco-modernists tend to be pro-technology. You know, it's the utopian narrative that technology can fix most things, and design intelligence can fix most problems. And design intelligence is largely about problem solving. The eco-modernists are sort of organised loosely around something called the Breakthrough Institute in the United States, which is a think tank, and they produced a polemical document in 2015 called the Eco-modernist Manifesto, which argued that we could have a good Anthropocene. And I'll come back to that later on in the lecture. Now, in the next bit of text that I'm putting on the slide, you can see at one end the Capitalocene and the Anthropocene. So debates about the nomenclature of the geological period that has not yet actually been officially decided upon by the Stratospheric Society in London, but it doesn't matter because the term Anthropocene is already a runaway term. In terms of popular culture, it's a meme. I mean, it's not going anywhere. Now, the eco-socialists, these texts correspond vertically, obviously. The eco-socialists would argue that the Anthropocene is still smacks of, or is still prone to a sort of, well, it's anthropocentric. It's still, and it applies to all people evenly, which is politically incorrect. It's really only 20 or 25% of the global population that, since the Industrial Revolution, are technically speaking physically responsible for climate change in terms of destabilising the atmosphere. So to call it a geological era with a generic term like the Anthropocene, which gathers all of humanity into the problem, is seen as A, inaccurate, and B, unjust. So the Capitalocene is an alternative expression which puts the blame for climate change squarely at the feet of neoliberal capital and the imperialism from the Industrial Revolution to now, and therefore makes it a cultural problem, a geopolitical problem, and not a natural phenomenon. So I'm really skating over these arguments, but I hope you get the point. The second piece of text, where I've written on the left-hand side rupture and on the other side continuity, are two interpretations of history, deep history. Rupture essentially means that the dawn of the Anthropocene and climate change is our Copernican revolution. This is radical change. And you can only deal with radical change radically, let's say. And the Anthropocene requires complete social, political, theological, philosophical, economic revolution. And on the other hand, continuity suggests that the narrative is that humans have always modified their environments, right? We've always done that. We're just now doing it at a slightly bigger scale. There's nothing really happening here that's any different to what has happened previously in history. And you can see how rupture, revolution versus continuity lend themselves to two very different narratives and have different socio-political economic consequences. And then if we now bring it closer to design culture, I think what you've got is mitigation on one hand, on the left-hand extreme. Mitigation means that if you want to mitigate, say, carbon emissions into the atmosphere, you need to deal with the source of the problem, so that would require radical change of industrial/post-industrial culture. In the middle, adaptation means that, well, it's happened, the crisis has occurred, the catastrophe has happened, all we can do is adapt to it. And that becomes, morphs into resilience theory and resilience practice. And resilience is derived from what we used to call sustainability, which proved itself to be a false utopia because it was predicated on harmony, whereas we know the natural world is not something that seeks harmony, it's a system that seeks equilibrium but always works through disequilibrium. And so sustainability has proven to be a fairly bankrupt, I think, or short-term philosophical direction. And, you could say, well, resilience is now sustainability without hope, I suppose. And on the far extreme, the more boyish and rather exciting fringe group of engineers who are trying to work with complex models and are developing proposals, as many of you would know, for geo-engineering the planet, which means consciously redesigning the atmosphere and managing the terrestrial surface of the planet and the oceans so that we can modify the Earth system at our own discretion and maintain a balance. Now, so I hope that's helpful. The science and then the humanities, and now to bring it home and closer to my particular discipline, landscape architecture, you really can't have a conversation about the planetary without referring to McHarg from Penn. McHarg wrote a book in 1969 that many of you will be familiar with called Design with Nature. And it was extremely polemical, part spiritual, part poetic, and above all, a practical document as to how you can, using GIS mapping techniques, make land use decisions that are part common sense but based on relatively objective readings of places. So, you don't build in floodplains, you don't put buildings on steep slopes, you keep forests upland of water, drinking water in catchments, you don't build on sand dunes, just all that stuff, right? It's basic. But McHarg was a very interesting character because he, as early as '69, he referred to the role of humanity as stewards of the planet, which is at once humbling and simultaneously hubristic, right? And that's the tension in landscape architecture between the humble and hubris. McHarg was trying to wrest, the Garden of Eden from the Abrahamic religions and bring it out to a planetary scale and render it logical with positivistic data and believed supremely in the rational application of design intelligence following nature's guidelines would deliver us. We could finally get human settlement, to fit the natural world. So there was a grand vision of synthesis yet to come. And McHarg has come in and out of fashion, of course, intellectually, and postmodern theory, what we used to call critical theory and cultural studies, of course, gave him a terrible beating. And rightly so. Not least of all because McHarg used nature as a higher authority, and postmodern theory, of course, teaches that nature is a cultural construct. So that in itself is interesting and problematic, but not only is nature a cultural construct, meaning we can all have relativistic views about what it is, the nature, of course, that we should follow in designing things is no longer there. It's been denatured by our activities. Nature is no longer a pure thing that you can refer to for... what he should have done is written a book called Design with Landscape. Then it would have been more limited and it would have been more accurate, because you can do, to a certain scale, you can design things that are tuned to landscape patterns and landscape ecology. And the world would be a better place if we did that. Now, what's interesting is that the most celebrated scientist of the Anthropocene, indeed the guy that coined the term, Paul Crutzen, atmospheric scientist, he has described the history of the Anthropocene as moving in 3 phases. The first begins with the Industrial Revolution, so 1800 onward. The second is the Great Acceleration from 1945 to now, where there's a peak in consumption and a peak in all the environmental negatives. An era of history, of course, which we're all born into. We should be mature enough and organised enough to steward the Earth. And I mean, he's wrong, of course, because we're clearly not ready to do that. And so I think he's probably 100 or 200 years ahead of when we will be perhaps ready to do that. And I'll hopefully come back to that point at the very end of the lecture to sort of put a ribbon on this thing if I can. Anyway, now this is a rather nice quote from James Lovelock, who, before Crutzen and even before the Anthropocene was coined as a term, Lovelock did more than anyone, also an atmospheric chemist, did more than anyone to popularise the idea that the Earth is a living entity of which we are a part, not a part. We're inside something, and we have a role to play as part of that dynamic ecology. This is also very interesting because we think we can describe the natural world as a series of objects, but we can't, because we're inside the Earth system. We are part and parcel of it. And that has aesthetic consequences and philosophical consequences. He wrote, "It takes a lot of hubris to even think of ourselves as stewards of the Earth. Do we want the remote and infinitely difficult task of managing the Earth? Do we want to be made accountable for its health? I would sooner expect a goat to succeed as a gardener than expect humans to become stewards of the Earth. There can be no worse fate for people than to conscript them to such a hopeless task." And that is the problem. That if humanity has put itself in the position of changing the basic functioning of the planet at a planetary scale, then we are deeply implicated in its workings, and yet we don't have the capacity or the intelligence really to cope with the situation that we find ourselves, which leads me to this. This is the artist Anthony Gormley. Of course, some of you will recognise it, but it's a reminder of the beautiful story from Prometheus. You know, Prometheus is our father, and Zeus was fond of Prometheus and says to Prometheus, Zeus is getting bored on Mount Olympus, and you know he says to Prometheus, "I want you to make me some pets," and they are the Anthropos. They are us. And so Prometheus makes humans out of clay, which he gets from between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, which is where we thought the Garden of Eden was, incidentally, and mixes that with the spit, Zeus's spit, and then Athena breathes on the clay, and you get us, human beings. And Zeus says to Prometheus, "Listen, to make these pets more interesting, give them consciousness. You know, not too much though. Give them intelligence so they'll be more interesting for us. But not so much consciousness that they can determine their own future." And of course, you know what happens. Not only does Prometheus give us foresight, he gives us technology, he gives us fire. And with that, of course, we have become gods. And so we find ourselves in a very interesting situation where we don't know if we're gardeners, a la McHarg, we don't know if we're goats, a la Lovelock, and we don't know if we're gods, a la Stuart Brand, who I'll introduce you to right now. Stuart Brand wrote in the 1960s, he said, "We are as gods, and should get good at it. That was in the late 60s. In other words, we've risen to this status as a global force, and therefore we have to get good at it. We have to take responsibility. We can't be bad gods. Although, of course, many gods are bad. And he updated it recently, and he says, we are as gods and we have to get good at it. In other words, we don't have a choice anymore. So deeply implicated are we in the workings of the Earth system that we have no choice but to take responsibility for what we've created, and I think that's both frightening and amazing, and that's what the lecture is about. Stuart Brand, interestingly enough, lobbied NASA with Buckminster Fuller, who we'll come to in a moment, he lobbied NASA to release the first, to release this image. They knew NASA had the image, and so Fuller and Brand started the lobbying to get the government to release this image, which is an extraordinary thing because it changed everything. I mean, it's the biggest cliche on earth, right? But it's hard to think of culture now without that image. And in the history of representation, it's probably the image, right? And you can interpret it in many ways. So the title of the lecture is Designing a Planet. Well, can we? And if so, how? And I'm going to run two lines of inquiry. One is more positive than the other. The second type, so there's two lectures actually, interwoven. You see, I told you it was going to get too complicated. But I'll do a sort of positive take on this question of can we design a planet, and I will also look through the metaphor of the terrarium darkly, because I think the terrarium is a perfect metaphor for the Earth system as a whole. It's a closed system, except for sunlight entering, and it's a perfect metaphor for our sort of fumbling engagement with the world. So the title of the second part of the lecture could be A Failed Terrarium, the Greatest Design Experiment on Earth. And so here is a child playing with a terrarium, and when I looked for how terrariums were communicated to children in the education department, I found a text that said, it gave teachers instructions as to how to teach the kids to make terrariums and how kids can get some basic biological relationships right, and then the kids take the terrarium home as a trophy of their emerging understanding of things. But it stressed the fact that many terrariums will fail. And it says, but don't worry, that's a good thing. Failed terrariums are, and I quote, a failed terrarium is good for discussion. And it seems to me that's where we find ourselves. The adults are experimenting with their terrarium at a planetary scale in a very similar way to the child in the image. Terrariums have their own fascinating history. Forcing plants to grow rapidly has been known. It was known in antiquity, but it was really the British that started putting things in Wardian cases, they were called. And it was with these rather beautiful Wardian cases that the British were able to beat the seasons and keep plants and insects throughout winter. But more importantly, it was to keep the dirty Victorian air, the pollution, away from what was inside. So it's a protective device. But then the British used it to move, tea from China to India and move plants around the world, and which have now become invasives. And so it had profound ecological consequences, but a very beautiful, simple tool for creating a closed ecology. And it also has a sinister side, because whilst it's caring and in some ways innocent, I say sinister because in the act of protecting what's inside, you invariably kill it over time. Although things can last for a very long time, you invariably kill those things. But it also sets up in the relationship between the viewer and the viewed. There's a classic Cartesian separation between subject and object. So for children to, for this child is being, if you like, this is a bit too far-fetched, but bear with me. This child is being indoctrinated into a Cartesian way of viewing the world, and that kid won't escape from that way of viewing the world for the rest of her life, probably. And then most of us are entrapped in that way of seeing. It's very hard to get out of that and see in an ecological way, because you need to see invisibilities, you need to see flows, you need to see things in time. I mean, it's really hard. It takes a great imagination to think ecologically, literally. The British took it further and decided to put the world into a terrarium with Crystal Palace, of course, as many of you would know, 1851. And in here was a Wardian case, which had from its inventor, which had a piece of moss that had been in the case for 17 years as one of the novel attractions. Now, the Crystal Palace, of course, goes the way of many things. It burnt down after it was moved. It burnt down in 1936, which leads us to Buckminster Fuller, who I mentioned at the outset. Fuller was really the master architect of the terrarium, and the geodesic dome became his signature building, which, loved by the military-industrial complex and hippies at the same time, oddly enough, and became a kind of ubiquitous symbol of techno-utopian optimism. And no one was more optimistic than Fuller, because he literally believed that design intelligence could solve all our problems and indeed solve the world's problems. He writes, his proposal was, or his theory in his book, Operating Manual for Spaceship Earth, a very famous book, make the world work for 100% of humanity in the shortest possible time through spontaneous cooperation without ecological offence or the disadvantage of anyone. Now, why he then did this project is unclear. This was a drawing, the dome was meant to hover. Why you would put a dome over Midtown Manhattan is, he never really explained this project. But what happened was, this project caught the eye of Walt Disney, that other great optimist. And Walt Disney said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to put a whole town inside a dome, so he bought land in Florida to do it. And we'll come to that in a moment. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, because Fuller did one project where he did get a building inside the terrarium, which is pretty interesting because you get a double entendre, architecture inside architecture. A world within a world. And this was the 1967 United States, the American Pavilion at the Montreal Expo, and it was titled The Creative America. The exhibition is inside the building, which is inside the bubble of Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome. Now then, some years later, this is what happened. And so, Crystal Palace burns down. Fuller's geodesic dome in Montreal, titled Creative America, its skin melts and it spews black smoke into the skies over Montreal. It's been reconstructed since, and of course, guess what it is now? It's called the Biosphere, and it's a place to educate children about climate change. Now, as I was saying, Walt Disney then proposed to put an entire township, utopian development, under a dome, under a Fuller dome, but he died before the project could be realised. This was Epcot, the Experimental Prototypical Community of Tomorrow, which is now a theme park, and that's what happens, of course, when you leave utopia in the hands of theme park executives and die on the job. The dome has congealed into a big golf ball, and they commissioned Ray Bradbury, the science fiction author, to write the narrative for the audio animatronic ride, which is inside the geodesic dome. And the audio animatronic ride takes you from the Big Bang to the future in 15 minutes. And it ends with this. It ends with this very didactic instruction. We have to go into space. And in a way, that's the latent dream of the terrarium. All terrariums ultimately are little sketch designs for closed ecosystems that we can totally control and will ultimately become intergalactic, which starts to move now the lecture into a different area, which I think is very interesting. I've started looking around to write a future history of landscape architecture in space that hasn't happened yet. And so I've been looking at closed ecosystems, which the Russians were extremely active in this regard. From the 70s onwards, the Russians were the most advanced. They were putting people in closed systems way before the Americans. But of course the Americans, not to be outdone, do it bigger and better later, as we will see momentarily. these experiments are about building up the actual science that would enable us to survive in a completely closed ecosystem as opposed to the open system of the Earth as we know it. And they're very interesting because they show you how complex, how inept we are, because they nearly all fail. And they show how unconsciously reliant we are upon, the Earth system as a functioning entity. We take everything for granted. And as soon as those systems are shut down in some way, it's a nightmare. In 1971, the first plants were sent into space. 75, the first vegetable garden, that was a breakthrough. Agriculture in space, of course, food. 1980 is an interesting year in the future history of landscape architecture in space because it was the first purely aesthetic design project. And you see it in the image. It's a small terrarium picture window. And the Valentin Lebedev, the Russian astronaut, you can see him looking wistfully into this image of the natural world and feeling homesick. And he himself became a renowned space gardener because he produced peas, lettuce, tomatoes, even coriander, which is a tricky plant, and onions in space. Where we're at in terms of gardening in space is the garden on the current space station. And it's about the size of a suitcase. But it's connected up to 180 sensors that feed data directly back to NASA. Bizarre, interesting, and perhaps portentous, Now, so the Americans, as I said, not to be outdone in this game, then built the McMansions of closed ecosystems with Biosphere 2. Biosphere 1, of course, is the Earth. Biosphere 2 is a model of the Earth, which was this project in Oracle, Arizona. And this is a very interesting thing and bizarre. And it was, who was involved in financing this? Steve Bannon, who has become well known because of his relationship with the Trump campaign and so on and so forth. But he had his hands in this thing, and a weird collection of investors and hippies and scientists and so on. So the idea was to create a completely closed ecology. In 1991, it was opened, or I should say, shut down, and the Biospherians, as they were called, or the Terranauts. And there, you can see them here on the opening day or the closing day. They go in and they lived in there for 2 years. And this was a sophisticated, project of getting the data on their physical health, and they had to work to manage the ecosystem, which of course proved to be hard work. Now, they were in there for 2 years, but by the end of the 2 years, they'd subdivided into warring factions. Cockroaches had completely overtaken the ecosystem, and it looked like this. And this is Roy Walford. Look, this is Roy on the left here after his 2-year experiment. This is him in the front, very chipper and playing a sort of leadership role as he did. He described this project as the Garden of Eden on a aircraft. What are they called? Anyway, a big military. Yeah. So it failed dreadfully, and then it was. The Times, the Time magazine listed it as one of the worst ideas ever, but actually it wasn't one of the worst ideas ever. It was a very interesting idea because it's really about, well, can we colonise space? Can we live in space? Can we regulate the Earth system? Can we control complex systems? And the funny thing is, of course, the people that produced Big Brother credited this with the inspiration for the show. So the conclusion from a report in '96 about Biosphere 2 was that at present there is no demonstrated alternative to maintaining the viability of Earth. No one knows yet how to engineer systems that provide humans with the life support to supporting systems that ecosystems produce for free. So there you have it. But you see, we are tenacious, if nothing. And now, out in the back blocks of Dubai, Bjarke Ingels from the architecture group BIG, the celebrity architect, has been commissioned to build what has been touted as the most sophisticated building ever. 5 geodesic domes, because geodesic domes, of course, are the preferred architectural language of anything to do with space and ecology. And the people will enter this building, and I think for only 1 year. They won't go for 2, they'll try for 1 and see what happens. NASA currently is saying, well, listen, trying to take stuff into space is a bit of a hassle, and it's about $10,000 per kilo of soil. So if you try to move the Earth into space, it's expensive and it's silly. So what they're working on is, seeding space with cellular tissue, and being able to direct the growth of those cells to produce. So using nature itself as a factory to produce materials and ultimately body organs and whatever you can print effectively. So that's a very interesting sort of development, I think, that biotech coupled with space colonisation. So let's come back to Earth, right? Back to Biosphere 1. And when you Google geoengineering, this is the sort of representation or quality that you get. These kind of school book diagrams that simplify things out. But if you look at and some of you may know this, but if you do look at the literature, the notion of creating a stratospheric veil is the idea that keeps coming to the top. A stratospheric veil is effectively sulfur particles pumped into the atmosphere by a fleet of high-flying aeroplanes, and that would reduce the albedo could reduce the albedo of the planet. Now, the sulfur particles are very, very good at deflecting sunlight back into space. So theoretically, you have a fairly cheap material that if you get it up there, it can stabilise global temperature. That's the theory. So I'll run you very quickly now the pros and the cons, because this is a very interesting debate that is taking place. Now, of course, the argument for is, well, this is nothing new. Why are you freaking out about us changing the atmosphere when you're prepared to change everything on the ground? Like, why is the sky sacred? Because people freak. They think it's polluted. It's just too much. So the argument for is, we've always done this, get over it. The alternative is, no, this is a fundamental transgression of the natural order of things. You don't modify the weather. And that's interesting in itself. The second argument is that well, humans have to take responsibility for the weather. I mean, we are as gods, we better get good at it. And the planet is undeniably heating up, so we need to modify the temperature. And if you want to save the lives of billions of people and so on and so forth, then we have to regulate the temperature. Because it's run away, the carbon is already there. It doesn't matter if you stop using fossil fuels tomorrow, the carbon is already in the system, the temperature is increasing, and it will increase for most of the 21st century as people try to lift themselves out of poverty, and so we will come ever closer to agreeing to a stratospheric veil. The argument against that, of course, is that this is now an act of God. I mean, the weather shouldn't be altered, because that is described in insurance policies as acts of God, when the weather does a cyclone hits or flooding or whatever. So if acts of God become acts of man, how the hell would you regulate it? And how do you deal with that legally, let alone, theologically? The next argument for is that, of course, it stabilises temperature, which is fantastic if it could do that. The argument against is that it could, and no one knows, because the modelling is, the Earth system is so sensitive. It could induce an ice age. That's the argument against it. It could flip the system. The argument for is that it would prevent sea level rise, because the ice would not melt, which is in everyone's best interest, because if the ice does melt, sea levels will rise 70 metres, as we all know, and you'll lose 50 of the major cities around the world, which are on the coast, and that's going to just project us into, centuries of chaos. The argument against is that by using a technological fix to regulate the temperature, you're just reinforcing the status quo. It'll just be business as usual. Well, if we can do that, then we can keep burning the fossil fuels, and of course technology comes to our rescue, and we never bear in mind all of the unforeseen negatives, downstream problems from technology. The argument for is that it could enhance agriculture. if we could control the temperature, the thermostat, through the stratospheric veil, we could actually ramp up productivity in certain parts of the planet by adjusting the seasons and the temperature, and that could produce more food cheaply for more people. The alternative is that it would alter the monsoon. If you alter the monsoon, billions of people stand to starve. Now, here's an interesting one. It could unite the world. It could bring, the way the ozone problem brought us together briefly, if we talk about the stratospheric veil, it becomes a kind of a United Nations in the sky, as it were. Alternatively, it is ungovernable and it could be weaponized. So, you know, how could we possibly govern it? And who would you blame for weather when it's bad? You know, imagine Putin and Trump facing off about the weather last Tuesday. It's cheap and it can be adjusted. There's an argument for. Alternatively, it's toxic and it's unpredictable. And finally, where would it stop? Right? If we start tinkering with the atmosphere, where would we stop? So that's a snapshot of the arguments for geoengineering the atmosphere. If we come down to the surface of the Earth now, this is what I'm very briefly going to illustrate is the pressure on land use that is occurring and will occur this century. Now, as I said, back of the envelope calculations, this is based on planting a plantation of trees on a 10-foot graticule, so 10-foot centres, so trees 3 metres apart, let's say. If you wanted to sequester the carbon emissions from 10 billion people living like Americans, and I'm making it 10 billion Americans because not that everyone wants to live like an American, but it's an aspiration of the global population, let's say, to consume the way Americans now consume. Or you could say Australians, people with a big ecological footprint. If we have a population of 10 billion people consuming as we do, which is what is going to happen this century in terms of the 10 billion, they may not all be able to consume as much as we do, but if they did, and you wanted to sequester their carbon at current rates, you would need 88% of the Earth's terrestrial ice-free surface to be a forest, a plantation. Now, you can't do that because you need to feed people simultaneously from that land. To feed 10 billion Americans, you need 93% of the world's terrestrial surface. So 88% for sequestration, 93% for food production, assuming food production doesn't change technologically. So there's an obvious contradiction right there. What would be left from that, and this is the frightening scenario, what would be left would be 7% of the planet, the ice-free surface. Although if the ice melts, there'll be more land will be liberated, I guess you could say, and maybe turned over to agriculture, but there'll be 7% left. About 3% of that is urban, 4% left for what we call biodiversity, which is just mountainous land that we can't think of anything better to do with. So it's a sort of a global zoo, 4%. The planet can't survive with 4% biodiversity. You need a relatively full house in the Earth system for it to survive. Biodiversity is not about charismatic animals. It's not even about our animals. It's about the richness of the soil. That's biodiversity. It's about microbes. It's about life in all its richness and complexity. And if you reduce that, the planet will seize up. It literally cannot function because the biosphere is a key part of its daily functioning. So it's incumbent upon us to preserve a significant amount of biodiversity. If you turn a lot of land over to plantations, either for carbon sequestration or food production, they're monocultures. They have very little ecological value. So this is where we come back to the eco-modernists, because they're arguing that what we need to do is decouple. They call it decoupling, which means we need to reduce our ecological footprint, not by being pious and eating less and doing less, but by applying design intelligence and technology to all of our problems. They argue that technology, so in this case, let's say robots work the agricultural landscapes, we can ramp up the productivity of agricultural land. If you decouple meat production from animals, from ruminants, you free up nearly 30% of the world's landscape right there. I mean, it's frightening because where would meat be produced? It would be produced in factories, but if possible, that would be a massive breakthrough. So those sorts of decouplings have incredible environmental value at a planetary scale. So eco-modernist arguments are quite interesting in that regard. And this reminds us of Holland, I would say. Holland is the most futuristic place on the planet. because they're imperiled by virtue of being, they've been under sea level rise. For them it's a joke. I mean, it's nothing new. But this is their agricultural system. Look at it. It's all in glass houses, so it's a terrarium. The whole country is a terrarium. And they're now a net exporter. One of the world's biggest net exporters of agricultural produce is Holland. Little pissy Holland. Unbelievable. And of course, the beauty of the Dutch is that they believe in planning and they believe in coordinated activity and design intelligence. And I'll show you another project later on, which I think is a fascinating project off the coast of Holland. Before we get there, E.O. Wilson has recently written, the great biologist, has written a book called Half Earth. He says, listen, 4% is not going to do it. You need to give 50% of the planet to biodiversity and humans can take the other 50%. Now, I don't know how he gets to that figure. He never really explains it because 33% of the planet is desert. So, you know, we either have to green the deserts for food production or green them for sequestration, or perhaps he's saying that the biodiversity will be the largely deserts and we'll take the other juicier stuff. I don't know. But Earl Ellis writes that reshaping half the Earth's land into a global conservation reserve would undoubtedly be the most challenging landscape design and planning process in history. Earl is a scientist, by the way. So scientists are talking about design. They are talking about designing the planet, so are the engineers. Designers aren't. Because, well, why? I don't know. We are. We're doing it tonight. We're trying to. I've now given, this is now a more accurate representation of the planet today. What we've done with this drawing, if you can call it a drawing, Planet Photoshop, we've just eliminated all of the land that is not protected. So this archipelago, you can just see Africa here. That's Africa, where there's been this incredible land grab, if you want to put it that way, by the global conservation community. But all of those fragments of land are protected areas classified by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, according to 5 or 6 categories, degrees of conservation strictness. And this is fascinating because this has been going on since the 70s. For 50 years, the conservationists have been out there amassing territory, and they now have accumulated 15.4% of the planet as protected area. And 196 nations around the world, excluding, of course, America, and I think it's Iraq and maybe Kuwait and Somalia, but everyone else has signed up. We're signatories to this. We've all agreed that we will reach a global target of 17% protected area by 2020. And that's what is happening with all the NGOs and the science/conservation organisations are working on a planetary scale to reach 17%. We've got about a year to go. And my research has been I've been getting involved with this community, which is, I'll come to that in a moment. There's 2 very important words in the small print of the document, what's called the Global Convention on Biological Diversity, which is headquartered at the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity. The Secretariat is in Montreal, under the auspices of the United Nations. There's 2 very important words, representative and connected. That means what we protect. If you want to get to 17% protected area, you can't just go into Siberia and say, here's a forest, there's another 3%, we're done. Because that's not representative of the world's ecological diversity. You need 17% of all of the eco-regions that constitute the planet, and there's about 850 of them. So you've got to get your 17% distributed. That's hard. The second is even harder. Connectivity means that all of the fragments you see there are as good as useless because the gene pool is locked into these fragments and can't move, and as climate change kicks in, well, already now, everything's on the move. Every animal, every plant, and certain people are on the move. And if they haven't got pathways, which you don't have in an archipelago, all of the land surrounding those fragments is hostile to species because it's our territory, it's farms and infrastructure and all the rest of it. So what we've got to do, what the small print of the convention is actually saying, you've got to amass 17% of the world's territory and you've got to connect it. And if you connect it, that's a whole different planetary model of land use. So anyway, if you calculate this out, we're at 15.4%. The aim is 17%, and you say, well, that's only 1.6% of the world's terrestrial surface. It's not much. But if you calculate it, it's nearly 700,000 central parks. So from a design planning perspective, you've got 700,000 central parks, and if you strung them together end to end, they would go around the planet 70 times. So that's a kind of Ariadne's thread, if you like, that you could weave through land to connect all of those fragments and open up pathways for species. So if we as a species were serious about planetary management and stewardship, that's what we would get busy on. And that's a very hard project, because you can imagine trying to weave a line through land use from A to B. When that land use has vested economic interests, it's almost impossible. But that is what's happening. It's what communities and governments are trying to do. And it's a design problem. So what I've been doing with the research that I've been conducting with students at Penn for the last 5 years, we asked a very simple question. And as you know, with research, it's always is it a good question? You need a good question. The good question was simply, where should those 700,000 central parks be on a global scale? Our conclusion was both, this work was bundled up into what is now a website called Atlas for the End of the World, Atlas for the Beginning of the Anthropocene, which has been a very interesting exercise, because there's about 800 maps on this website, there's artwork, there's polemical writing, I mean, there's a bunch of stuff. But what it actually does is it audits many of the nations around the world to see how they're performing with regard to the 17% target. And it does so by focusing on the world's biodiversity hotspots, because they're genetically the richest places and they're the most threatened. Now, the title is catchy, but of course it's not the end of the world. No, I don't believe that for a second. It's the end of a very particular world. And what I mean is, it's within the genre of the Atlas. It's the end of the world that began in 1570, when the world's first atlas was produced by Abraham Ortelius in Antwerp. He produced the world's first atlas, and which is really a guide for imperial and ecological conquest. And since 1570 to now, you all know what's happened. Modernity has overtaken the planet, for better and for worse. And so the Atlas for the End of the World is saying, well, it's the end of Ortelius's world. You can no longer just ravage ecosystems and indigenous peoples. And so that's the way we've positioned it within the literary genre of the Atlas. What we conclude from our study is that the brown areas of the world's biological hotspots, there's 36 of them. In short, 21 of them, the green areas are meeting the conservation target of 17%, the brown areas are not. In the world, this is the world's most valuable territory for genetic diversity. 21 out of 36 are not meeting the 17% target, and when you break it down to the eco-regional scale, 221 are not meeting the target. They've got a year to do so. So this is a geopolitical document. It's embarrassing for the United Nations. It's embarrassing for particular nations, because we audit exactly what they're doing with their land use in these biological hotspots. And I'll zoom into one to give you an example of how we've been doing the mapping. This is the Atlantic forest hotspot on the coast of Brazil. And the map, there's a lot of work in this, but the maps are quite simple. The green bar chart shows you that how much land is protected is the green area. The size of the actual box shows you the area that they need to protect if they're going to reach 17%. So they're significantly short. I can't read it from here. They're down around 8% probably. Here in the southwest, the West Australian hotspot, you're at about 16.9%. So we're doing really well here in terms of meeting the 17% target. But those numbers change when you get it down to an eco-regional scale, which is smaller than the whole, that's more precise than the whole hotspot. So there's the Atlantic forest. We break it down into individual eco-regions, and we do the same calculation. So this gets quite precise for governments, investment, communities to start directing the conservation dollar into landscape restoration projects at the eco-regional scale. So I'll zoom through these now. And now, all of this sounds perhaps too like pie in the sky or too big or whatever, but it's actually, this project of restoration is actually happening. This is a map that we've assembled of all of the big conservation projects going on right now at a planetary scale. The dashed lines are hypothetical, the dark green lines are projects that have been constructed, and the lighter green ones exist. So for the first time, this is an extraordinary drawing, because for the first time in history you can see at a species level we are reconstructing the ecology upon which we are dependent. And I put it to you that we're the first species to do that. And that's profound, because whenever species thrive biologically, they unconsciously, bring about their own demise because they overexploit the territory. That's what the tragedy of the commons means. But we, potentially, this is where we get our consciousness, back to Prometheus and Zeus. If we can outsmart that law of nature, that we can consciously design the ecology upon which we depend, then we might be the first species to get out of that natural bind. And that's interesting because, just semantically, people always think we need to be more natural. We actually need to be unnatural, if we want to avoid our own demise through our own success, as it were. Anyway, 3 quick projects, or 4. The first in the top left is called Y2Y, from Yukon to Yellowstone. It's a conservation project that's about 2,000 miles in scale. Incredible project. The other box on China is the National Ecological Security Plan for China, done by a landscape architect. Incredible project. The little cross is off the coast of Holland. I promised you something there. And the dashed lines is another fun project I'm doing with students where we're planning walking trails at that scale. Here's Y2Y. This is in Banff National Park, and this is beautiful because the Y2Y, as I said, is 2,000 miles of negotiation to try and stitch together landscape connectivity so species can move. And it involves hundreds of different vested interests, but it's also about precision. So that's a very precise project there to get over that barrier and connect that biology with that biology. So this issue of connectivity for species and the flows of things and creating refugia and flows at a planetary scale, I think, is fascinating. We are doing, this is a conceptual project, we're doing it what I call World Park, the idea of trails as a catalyst for investment, one running north-south from Alaska down to Patagonia. This connects lots of existing trails, but it fills in the gaps, and it connects all the protected areas, and it connects the many biodiversity hotspots. So those nations could invest in a walking trail which attracts humans, and humans can be quite good, if you like, as conservation agents. People could work on landscape restoration projects and hang out in that territory. It takes 3 years to walk, incidentally, which would be good. I mean, it'd be good, very good for a lot of young Americans to just piss off and walk for 3 years instead of standing around, sending profound messages to everyone. And then there's another trail going east-west from Java across to Morocco. So we're trying to work that out, seriously work it out. Cost it, design it. I don't mean design it in detail, but make sure it's doing the right thing in the right places. This is the other project I wanted to mention, which is by Conjian Yu, a landscape architect in China. He has a brilliant career because he's been able to convince the party to do big things. Conjian Yu has a plan for the whole of China, which was endorsed by the government. And we don't have time to, there's thousands of drawings that get you to this point. This is the final drawing. The very dark green areas are no-go, don't touch them. It's got to be protected at all costs. Lighter green is leading nest protection and so on. The grey areas are where China, according to Conjian Yu, should develop cities, and you can basically build in the grey areas without any ecological consequence. Now this is interesting because President Xi said we need to move China from a gross domestic product civilization to an ecological civilization. That's an incredible thing for a world leader to say. But it's also a frightening thing because here's the dark side of ecology. You can imagine that all the people that were moved in China for modernity now being moved again for ecology. And they could do it. I mean, so it's going to be interesting to see what happens in China because they know that their survival depends on how they manage that 5,000-year-old farm of theirs. And, so this goes to a question of national planning. America, of course, China has a plan, as we've just seen. America has no plan. So it's a question of whether a laissez-faire economy can possibly endure the 21st century. We sort of have a semi-plan. You know, we could have a plan because we're small and we have a strong belief in centralised government, but anyway, that's a bit of a distraction. We'll just move on. Here's the Dutch project I wanted to I promised you. This is the little cross off the coast of Holland. This is fascinating. And this gets back to the point I made about precision and not all just big things. This is the sand motor. It's called, some of you would know this. The sand motor is off the coast of Holland. It was conceived by Marcel Steve, a Dutch engineer. Now, as you know, the Dutch can only survive if their coast is constantly jacked up to keep the ocean out. And all the water of the nation is totally managed, very precisely. Now, the Dutch are bringing, they mine sand from about 10 miles off the coast, bring it to the coast and dump it, and they've been dumping it all the way up the coast. He said, well, it would be much more efficient if we just dumped it all in one spot and then let nature do the work. So the sand motor, you see the sand being dumped here. Here is the sand motor. That's the sand motor. It's just a place where you deposit the sand, and then the natural currents move all that sand up the coast and deposit it exactly where the Dutch wanted along the coastline. And I say exactly because this is about modelling. They modelled the project prior to construction, and they model it constantly now. So this is dynamic, digital nature, let's say. But it's also about, I mean, at a planetary scale, it's a form of nanotechnology, right? It's very precise, harness the energy of the system itself to do the work. And they are now exporting this intelligence, and they have a conference every 5 years to interpret the results because they're constantly modelling it. And I just think that's an extraordinary, to me that's a sort of anti-object of the Anthropocene, right? I think it's a great artwork, if I could even be so bold as to say. Because it has an aesthetic. It's an aesthetic of flow and it's temporal and so on. Okay. I'm going to finish in a moment because I've been going for too long, I know that. And I want to drink more than any of you probably. The final piece of the research that I've been doing is not just about land use and the conservation targets, it's about urbanisation. I'm trying to get urbanisation and conservation in the same space. What that has meant is we've looked at all the cities in the hotspots. See all those yellow dots on that map? That indicates cities in the world's most valuable biological territory. They are all, 92% of them, we conclude, are sprawling directly into endangered species. So the biological community is saying these are really valuable places, really valuable animals. Urbanisation is happening on the other hand, and they are on an absolute direct conflict course. This is largely going on under the radar of the international planning and design community. So we've done the mapping that makes it quite precise, although here the scale is crude. These are 5 by 5 kilometre pixels. So I've taken the research from this scale, which identified the problem. Everywhere where you see yellow there represents a flashpoint between endangered species and urban growth out to 2030, based on Karen Sito's work at Yale. We've put all the mapping together to create these results. So we've boiled it down now to a more manageable set of 33 cities, which are the biggest and the fastest growing in the hotspots. Now, they're sort of nominal hotspot capitals. And of course, Perth is one of them. Now, so we've spent, the mapping, it looks easy, but mapping is hard. It's hard. There's a lot of grunt work in this mapping. This is Los Angeles, which is in a hotspot, the Californian floristic province. All of the red you see now at this more detailed scale is where you've got direct conflict between urban growth to 2030 and endangered species. And I can show you that that's basically the case in every, well, of course it's the case because we're growing, we're urbanising, cities are sprawling. The problem is they're doing it with such wanton violence and destruction. So we've done the full set, and right now what I'm working on is bringing representatives of these cities across to the university, and we can start to get together and discuss how we move from a descriptive phase of research to a projective phase of trying to design our way out of this problem. So there's Perth, as you all know. The red shows you the, oh, sorry, it's going, just a moment. The computer's trying to grunt through these maps. Come on. Jules, I think I've burnt your computer out. So there's Perth. So those red areas represent conflict out to 2030. We all know this. And if I zoom you now into the little bit of red in the top, come on. Well, we've skipped a bit, but it looks like that, as you know. That's the edge of Perth today. I drove up there the other day to have a look at it, and it's as frightening as ever. And you know, the question becomes, how can you curate the growth of a city so that it avoids the obliteration of that biodiversity? And that to me is very interesting because it's about, well, as I say, the peri-urbanism is different. We're so preoccupied with city centres and waterfronts and laneways and bars and all that stuff. I get all that, but we've been so preoccupied with urban design in the sort of classical urban-centric sense that we've neglected the more interesting, perhaps from a landscape architectural perspective, the biologically rich peripheral areas of cities and all of that landscape that is neither suburbia nor agriculture nor conservation. You know, that really interesting in-between kind of shitty land that's hard to define. And I think that peri-urban edge of cities is totally new territory and worth exploring, aesthetically as well as, you know, from a planetary way. There are very few models as to how to deal with peri-urbanism and the tensions I'm talking about. This is work from Richard Foreman, the Harvard ecologist in Barcelona. Everyone knows Barcelona, it's in the red box there, but Foreman's project is the scale that you see. It's a vast landscape scale. But the problem for us is there's nothing between that vast scale and then the sort of detailed urban design scale of Barcelona itself. There's another aspect to this that is not such an issue here on your radars, but it is one that is globally very important because at least 1 billion people are predicted to move into what we call informal settlements. At Penn, we do a lot of studios on this stuff and get students involved. One of my colleagues is working on this peri-urban problem, David Gouverneur, and he argues that it's good, but you just need to direct it. It's not a problem, it's not bad. Humans can always self-organise urbanism. You just need to curate it so that it goes there, not there. And his whole theory and methodology is to provide the infrastructure for that to happen. So it is the century of urbanisation. This is the concluding, I will conclude now. You can see the planet on the left, thoroughly urbanised. That will continue apace for the rest of the century at least. As people move into cities, population drops, population will stabilise, the death rate will go up, we may decouple from land. The problem is that we've built this incredible system for ourselves, which is ubiquitous connectivity for our intelligence and for the movement of materials, but that has been at the expense of everything else in the living world. So the challenge for us is to grow, to urbanise the planet, but to also create the infrastructure for everything else that is struggling to survive. Because that on the left, without the healthy systems that we've drawn on the right, is fatal and self-destructive, ultimately. On the right-hand side, just as a logo, you know, we've connected all the protected areas, we've revegetated all the major riparian corridors, and you start to see the sort of, it's an indicative image of a healthy body. All the urbanism is there, of course, in that image on the right. And I think that's what's going to happen, on an optimistic note. I think that's what's going to happen, not this century, because this century is going to be about climate change refugees, right? The sea levels are going to rise, it's going to be chaos. But I think we'll learn a lesson after that, and I think population will stabilise through, as I said, urbanisation. The weather may even settle down again in another 1 or 2 centuries, and it's then that I think we have the conscious potential through our intelligence to. We certainly can't design the planet, because as I said, you can't understand nature even at the subatomic level. You can't predict nature. Catherine Hales once said, you could stick a pin over the entire surface of the planet, stick monitoring devices that were just 10 centimetres away from each other. You still couldn't get a model of the dynamic of the system. So we can't design a planet, but we can certainly design it to the extent that it will function as a healthy organism upon which we depend. So I don't think we can design a planet as in total control, but we're certainly going to give it a try. Thank you very much. I'm sorry it was so long.